Long after the Whitlocks were buried, the mansion still hums with the sound of supper. Somewhere inside, an empty seat waits, and it might just be for you. The story of the Whitlocks begins, as so many macabre tales do, at the dinner table. Their estate, a brooding house of stone and shadow that squatted at the edge of town, was said to harbor customs so strange that even the boldest travelers quickened their pace when passing its iron gates. But of all the rumors that swirled about the family, none clung as tightly or as horrifically as the whisper of the empty chair. It was not truly empty, of course. Not in the way you or I might picture. The Whitlocks had a peculiar way of blurring the line between the living and the dead, insisting that those who departed this life never really departed the household. Sorry to interrupt, but I gotta ask, where are you tuning in from? Drop it in the comments. Death, to them, was merely a change of state, and to exclude the deceased from daily rituals would have been not only unthinkable, but disrespectful. Supper, being the most sacred of their rituals, demanded full attendance. Imagine, then, a long oak table polished to a somber gleam, surrounded by heavy chairs that groaned beneath the weight of generations. The fire crackling in the hearth, casting wavering shadows across portraits of long-faced ancestors that lined the dining room walls. The Whitlock children, pale and obedient, took their places without question, and at the head of the table, dressed in fine clothing and positioned with deliberate care, sat a figure who was not among the living. Neighbors spoke of it in hushed tones. A grandfather who had died suddenly, only to be propped at his old seat, his stiff hands resting in his lap as though waiting for the meal to begin. An aunt, embalmed in silence, her glassy eyes catching the candlelight. They were not buried, not carried away to consecrated ground, but kept within the walls of the manor, called to supper again and again until time itself seemed to forget whether they belonged among the living or the dead. To the children of the house, there was nothing frightening in it. They learned early to pass the bread to their lifeless grandmother as though she might reach for it. They bowed their heads in grace, pretending the dead whispered their amen in unison. When guests dared to attend these suppers on rare occasions when business or obligation brought them under the Whitlocks' roof, they often left pale and shaken, whispering that the air in that dining room was colder than the corridors of any grave. The Whitlocks would smile at the horror of outsiders, almost smug in their conviction. "Why should we abandon them?" they asked. "They were with us in life. They remain with us now." And indeed, in their minds, to bury a loved one beneath the soil was the true cruelty. Separation, abandonment, the stripping away of presence. Better, they believed, to keep them seated where they had always belonged by the firelight, at the table, within the circle of kin. It was not an isolated incident, but a pattern, a tradition rooted so deeply into the family's marrow that generations upheld it without question. The dead dined with the living, their silent company as natural to the Whitlocks as bread and wine. Over time, however, the line blurred not only within the walls of the manor but in the town beyond. Whispers grew into folklore hardened into legend, and the Whitlocks became known not for their wealth or their lineage, but for their refusal to let go. And so, whenever night fell over the countryside and the villagers locked their doors against the creeping dark, one could almost picture it. Candles guttering, children bowing their heads, and at the long table of the Whitlocks, an empty chair never truly empty, forever filled by the weight of the dead. The Whitlocks were not always a name spoken with unease. In fact, when they first arrived in Hollow Creek in the early 1802, they were regarded as a family of promise and prosperity. They came from Virginia stock, their wagons heavy with trunks of silver, portraits in gilded frames, and books whose leather spines bore the dust of generations. To the settlers of Hollow Creek, a rough-hewn town where cabins leaned and mud roads clung to boots, the Whitlocks seemed like nobility stepping down into the wilderness. The patriarch, Silas Whitlock, purchased acres of land that hugged the bend of the creek, choosing the highest ground on which to build the family's manor. From its first beams, the Whitlock estate stood apart, a sprawling house of stone and timber, its windows tall and glinting, its roof a sharp crown above the trees. Locals watched it rise with both awe and suspicion. It was said no home in Hollow Creek should be so grand, not when most families still slept 2 or 3 to a bed. Yet wealth bought silence, and the Whitlocks were generous when they wished to be. Silas donated heavily to the church, ensured that the town's first schoolhouse was furnished with books from his library, and paid fair wages to the laborers who worked his land. His wife, Margaret, carried herself with a quiet elegance that reminded some of a lady from Charleston or Richmond, though she seldom left the house except to attend services. Together they had 4 children: Thomas, the eldest and heir; Ruth, whose sharp eyes missed nothing; and the younger twins, Abigail and Henry, who grew up like shadows of each other, inseparable and strange. Despite their standing, the Whitlocks were never quite embraced. They hosted gatherings at the manor in the first years, grand dinners where roast venison and imported wines were served, but the invitations dwindled, and so too did the willingness of the townsfolk to attend. There was something unsettling in the way the Whitlocks spoke of death. Some families in Hollow Creek told of how Silas, during a dinner toast, once remarked that his forebears never truly left them, that in Whitlock blood there was no final parting. At the time it was brushed off as sentiment, a flourish of words, but over the years it took on a darker resonance. The children, too, caused whispers. Ruth was often seen wandering the creek at dusk, speaking aloud as though in conversation with someone unseen. Abigail and Henry played games in the churchyard, leaving small tokens on headstones and treating it like their own playground. When reprimanded by Reverend Hargrove, the twins only laughed and said the dead liked their company. By the mid-century, Hollow Creek had come to view the Whitlocks less as benefactors and more as enigmas. Their manor, with its long windows shuttered against the sun, seemed to breathe a chill into the air around it. And though no one could quite name what set them apart, the townsfolk agreed that the Whitlocks carried with them a shadow, something older than Hollow Creek itself, something that bound them together more tightly than money or land ever could. It was this sense of mystery, this air of strangeness, that laid the groundwork for the legend. A legend that would one day claim the Whitlocks did not bury their dead, but seated them, dressed and silent, at their dinner table as though to prove that in Hollow Creek, the Whitlocks were never willing to let go. The Whitlock mansion rose from the edge of Hollow Creek like a blackened crown against the trees. Built in the late 1802, it was a sprawling Gothic structure with spires that pierced the sky and windows that reflected the moonlight as if it were glass eyes watching the town below. The people of Hollow Creek would glance at it from afar, never daring to come closer than the bend in the road where the woods began. To most, the mansion was less a home and more a warning, a grim silhouette that whispered of things better left alone. The house itself seemed to resist the passage of time. While other homes in the county had sagged under decades of weather, the Whitlock estate stood sharp and severe, its black slate roof intact, its stone walls unyielding. The iron gates, though mottled with rust, still creaked open with unsettling precision whenever a carriage approached. For the townsfolk, the mansion was both a marvel and a menace. It was the place where light seemed swallowed whole, and where whispers seemed to echo even when the halls stood empty. Children who grew bold enough to dare each other often ran through the overgrown path that led up to its front steps. They swore they heard voices behind the windows, though no one was ever visible. Others claimed the house itself breathed that if you pressed your ear against the walls, you would hear the faint sighs of something trapped inside, restless and yearning. By day, it looked like a relic of wealth. By night, it was a cathedral for the dead. Inside, the mansion carried the same oppressive presence. The grand entry hall was lined with oil portraits of long-gone Whitlocks, their pale faces painted in meticulous detail, eyes following any visitor who dared cross the threshold. The chandeliers hung heavy with dust, their crystal droplets dull as if even light itself had refused to linger there. Velvet drapes sealed out the sun, making the air cool and thick. It was said that the Whitlocks rarely entertained guests, preferring their solitude, though many suspected the true reason was to keep their rituals hidden from curious eyes. What unnerved the townsfolk most was how the mansion seemed to amplify sound in strange ways. Whispers carried down corridors, growing louder as they traveled, until a secret murmur spoken in the dining room might echo in the farthest wing. Doors creaked shut when no one touched them. At night, the faint scrape of chairs dragging across the wooden floors could be heard from the road. To those outside, it was as though the house itself was alive, its timbers groaning, its windows sighing, its foundations murmuring secrets of the family it sheltered. The Whitlocks themselves only added to the unease. They were rarely seen in town, preferring to send servants on errands for supplies. Rumor had it that the Whitlock patriarch, a man of imposing height and sunken eyes, had specifically designed the house to accommodate rituals of remembrance. The phrase was whispered but never explained, though many claimed it had something to do with the family's peculiar devotion to their dead. It was in that mansion on the edge of the woods, away from the scrutiny of neighbors, that the Whitlocks perfected their rituals. The dining hall, long and cavernous, had a table that could seat 30, though only a fraction of those chairs were filled by the living. Townsfolk swore they saw flickers of candlelight at odd hours, shadows shifting behind windows when the Whitlocks were supposedly alone. The mansion became the stage for gatherings where the dead were not mourned but hosted, their presence as vital to the Whitlocks as the bread and wine served at the table. The Whitlock mansion was not simply a residence. It was a vessel, a container for grief, obsession, and perhaps something darker. In its rooms, generations passed without ever leaving, their whispers absorbed into the very walls. By the time the legend began to take form, Hollow Creek no longer thought of the house as belonging to the Whitlocks. It belonged to the dead, and the family merely lived among them. Among the relics left behind by the Whitlock family, there exists a series of journals and yellowed letters that speak more than idle rumor ever could. These writings, penned in an elegant but increasingly erratic hand, reveal not only the lives of a family bound by wealth and isolation, but also the shadows of their thoughts, their consuming fixation with mortality. It was not a casual interest, nor the ordinary musings of a family familiar with grief in an age where death was commonplace. No, what the Whitlocks cultivated was something far deeper, almost ritualistic. Their written words exposed the gradual weaving of death into daily life until it no longer stood as an ending, but as a presence to be honored, preserved, and even entertained. The earliest surviving entries, attributed to Nathaniel Whitlock, the stern patriarch who first brought the family name to prominence in Hollow Creek, set the tone. In his journal, bound in cracked leather and dated 1837, he muses on the stillness of corpses, remarking that the body seemed too complete to be left to rot beneath soil. "It is a cruelty," he wrote in one entry, "to consign such beauty to the earth, when time has barely touched the face." His words carry none of the reverence for heaven or the afterlife one might expect from a man of his station. Instead, his fascination lay in the body itself, the vessel, the shell, the quiet mask left behind. He wrote of preserving insects in amber, flowers between pages, and wondered why humanity should not grant itself the same privilege. His wife, Eleanor, shared in these obsessions. Her letters to her sister, many of which survived thanks to the Whitlock archives, speak of elaborate mourning rituals, of black veils and shadowed parlors that stretched far beyond the expected weeks of grief. "Why should grief be hurried?" she asked in one letter dated 1842. "The dead still speak in the silence. I feel them here beside us, as though the walls of the house bend to listen." Such words suggest that even in their earliest days in Hollow Creek, the Whitlocks did not view death as absence, but as an extension of the living household. As the generations passed, this fascination ripened into something more grotesque. By the mid-1800s, the journals of their son, Jonathan, revealed that the family had begun to experiment with preservation techniques. He recorded the process of drying small animals with herbs and salts, noting with clinical precision how the body stiffened, how the eyes hollowed yet held an uncanny expression of watchfulness. What began with curiosity over dead pets and farm animals soon escalated. Rumors whispered through the town of Hollow Creek that Jonathan had ordered chemicals from faraway suppliers, powders and tinctures more suited for morticians than country gentlemen. His writings confirm it. He kept a ledger of costs, meticulously recording shipments of arsenic and formalin. The Whitlocks' fixation was not hidden from the household staff. One maid, a woman named Clara who worked briefly in the mansion in 1860, later recounted her experiences to her granddaughter. The tale, passed down orally and eventually written in a local folktale collection, describes candlelit rooms where Jonathan and Eleanor could be heard chanting softly, their words unintelligible but punctuated with laughter. "They talked to the dead as though they were seated in the room," Clara reportedly said. "And sometimes, when you leaned too close to the door, you could swear another voice answered back." What is most chilling about these documents is not the scientific curiosity they display, but the intimacy with which the Whitlocks wrote of death. It was never described in cold, distant terms. Instead, they spoke of it as a guest, a companion who deserved respect, space, and attention. Their words drip with affection for lifeless forms, for pale faces pressed between folds of linen. One note, scrawled in Jonathan's later years, reads simply, "The dead are more faithful than the living. They do not betray. They do not abandon. They remain." By the time these writings surface in the historical record, the line between mourning and obsession had been utterly erased. Death was no longer a specter lurking outside their door. It had been invited in, given a seat at the table, and offered a permanence that denied the natural decay of flesh. From these letters and journals, one can trace the steady descent of the Whitlocks. From grief-stricken romantics into something altogether darker. Custodians of the dead, unable to let go, unwilling to accept that life must eventually surrender to silence. The townsfolk of Hollow Creek, though excluded from the family's private rituals, could not help but sense this strange devotion. Stories began to ripple outward, whispers of bodies not buried, of chambers perfumed with strange herbs, of a family that spoke of their departed as though they had merely retired for the evening. In the minds of the Whitlocks, however, nothing was amiss. They had not lost their loved ones, they had simply found a way to keep them close, to blur the boundary between presence and absence until it no longer existed. It is in these writings, fragile with age but unflinching in their detail, that the seed of the legend is most clearly planted. The Whitlocks did not stumble upon their reputation by chance. They cultivated it, word by word, ritual by ritual, until the very air of their mansion seemed to thicken with the presence of those who should have long been at rest. It was the summer of 1847 when the first whispers of true madness began to cling to the Whitlock family like ivy on the stones of their home. Eleanor Whitlock, the matriarch of the house, had been the quiet anchor of the family. Unlike her husband, Elias, who bore a reputation for eccentricity and shadowed dealings, Eleanor was remembered by the townsfolk as polite, if distant. Her presence at Sunday service, her cool nod of acknowledgement at the market, and her graceful composure at community events gave the impression of a woman of refinement. That impression ended the evening she died. Her passing was sudden, as if death had plucked her without warning. No lingering illness, no long decline. Eleanor simply collapsed in the dining hall one evening as supper was being laid. Some servants claimed she gasped Elias's name before slumping, her hand clutching at the air. Others insisted her face betrayed not fear, but a strange serenity. The details blurred in the retelling, but the fact remained. Eleanor was gone. The natural course would have been to summon the undertaker, to prepare her for burial in the Whitlock family plot, where her kin already lay beneath carved headstones among the trees. But Elias refused. With a steadiness that unnerved even those closest to him, he declared that Eleanor had not truly left them. He ordered the servants not to move her body from the dining table. When they protested, terrified by the weight of their master's grief and his chilling command, he threatened to dismiss them, reminding them of their reliance on the Whitlock fortune. Thus began the grim spectacle. Eleanor's body was propped upright in her chair at the head of the table. A shawl was draped across her shoulders, her hair carefully brushed and arranged, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Elias insisted that supper continue that very evening, as though nothing had changed. Servants reported trembling as they placed dishes before her, glancing nervously at her lifeless face, while Elias raised his glass in a toast, speaking to her as though she might reply. In the days that followed, decay set in, and with it a dreadful transformation. The Whitlocks were wealthy enough to have access to rudimentary preservation methods, and Elias, fascinated by the art of embalming he had studied in obscure texts, attempted to preserve his wife. He sent for strange powders, tinctures, and unguents from distant apothecaries. He smeared her skin with oils, packed her body with herbs, and kept the dining room heavy with incense. It was said the scent of lavender and myrrh could be smelled from the gates of the estate, mingled with a sourness that betrayed the futility of his efforts. The servants, increasingly horrified, abandoned their posts one by one. The few who stayed claimed Elias held nightly conversations with Eleanor, his voice warm and affectionate, as if she were answering him. He served her portions of roasted meats and stews, sometimes pressing a spoon to her lips. Those who watched said his madness grew with every passing day. What unsettled Hollow Creek most, however, was not just Elias's refusal to bury his wife but his insistence that visitors treat her as living. Neighbors who were invited to dine found themselves staring at the matriarch's preserved body, her glazed eyes catching the candlelight, her form dressed in finery for each occasion. Some fled the house in disgust, while others whispered that Elias had succeeded, in some uncanny way, in blurring the line between life and death. When at last Eleanor's body was removed, whether buried, hidden, or destroyed, no one could agree the seed of the tradition had already been planted. Elias had shown that grief could be twisted into ritual, that love could rot into obsession. At the Whitlock table, death was no longer the end of companionship, but merely another guest to be seated, fed, and acknowledged. And so the townsfolk of Hollow Creek began to mutter the tale. The Whitlocks, who kept their dead at supper. A story that would outlive Eleanor herself, and one that would stain the family's name for generations. What the people of Hollow Creek whispered about in fearful tones found its roots in the peculiar craft the Whitlocks developed for themselves, an art not of healing, but of preservation. When most families buried their loved ones in the earth with prayer and ceremony, the Whitlocks refused the finality of a grave. Instead, they reached back into old books, inherited journals, and fragmented folk remedies in pursuit of a darker science, keeping the dead from looking dead. It began with the matriarch's body, which her husband insisted must remain at the head of the dining table. At first, he refused to let servants open the windows, for fear that the draft might hasten decay. But when the inevitable set in the skin loosening, the sweet yet rancid odor thickening the air, he turned to the shelves of their library. There he found writings that spoke of ancient practices, of spices and salts used by far-off cultures to stave off the corruption of flesh. He seized upon these fragments, instructing his staff to gather herbs from the surrounding woods, barrels of salt from town, and even candle wax to coat the skin. The servants, horrified but loyal, obeyed. They rubbed the body with rosemary and sage, believing the herbs could purify what nature sought to undo. They packed salt along the body's cavities, pressing it into the hollows where rot first blooms. Wax was melted and smoothed across her hands and face, sealing in what beauty remained, masking the pallor that deepened each passing day. By the time visitors arrived, she looked less like a corpse and more like a figure caught between life and lifelessness, unnatural, yes, but still recognizable as the woman who once presided over the Whitlock table. But such methods could not halt time, only delay it. As weeks became months, the family grew more inventive, even ritualistic. Herbs were placed not only on the body but around the table itself, tucked into napkins and scattered beneath plates to cloak the odor. Resin from the surrounding pines was burned in the hearth, the smoke curling through the air to disguise the unmistakable stench of mortality. At night, Diaries record, the patriarch sat by candlelight, dabbing tinctures of vinegar and spirits of wine onto her lips, as though he might coax some memory of color back into them. He called this devotion, though others would later name it madness. The children, too, became participants. They were taught to carry the burden of tending the preserved as though it were an extension of filial duty. Letters describe them braiding herbs into garlands to drape across her chair, or sprinkling fragrant oils onto her hair to restore a semblance of vitality. It became a ritual before every meal, not only the setting of the table, but the tending of the dead. By the time neighbors began to hear rumors of what took place inside the mansion, the Whitlocks had already expanded their methods. They experimented with powders that dried the flesh, oils that darkened the skin, and even rudimentary stitching when parts of the body began to betray the process. Every imperfection became a challenge to be met, every sign of decomposition another puzzle in the family's ongoing obsession. What began as desperation turned into tradition, and tradition into ritual. Preserving the dead became not an act of grief but of pride, a craft passed down, refined, and perfected. And with each generation, the Whitlocks grew further from the living world around them, shaping a legacy bound not by love of life, but by an unyielding desire to cling to death. The story of the Whitlocks took its darkest turn when the practice that began with one body became an expectation, a ritual that defined them more than their fortune or their land. What was once whispered about in fearful tones as a singular act of grief began to spread across generations, carried forward as if it were a sacred family duty. The Whitlocks did not merely preserve their dead, they made them participants in the most intimate of family customs, supper. At first, the act seemed almost pitiable, born of unbearable sorrow. The patriarch had refused to bury his wife, insisting she still belonged in her chair at the head of the table. Children had grown accustomed to her silent presence, their eyes darting between the food before them and the still form whose lips would never move again. It was strange, it was unsettling, but it was theirs. When visitors came, the Whitlocks grew defensive, locking the dining hall doors and insisting meals be taken in smaller parlors. But behind those closed doors, the long dining table began to host more and more lifeless guests. As years passed, one death followed another, and with each, the practice hardened into ritual. A son who died of fever was placed beside his mother, his skin darkened with age despite the herbs and salts that clung to him. A daughter, struck down in childbirth, was seated opposite him, her frail body propped upright with cushions. The Whitlocks convinced themselves that death was not a dismissal, only a change in condition. A family member's voice might be stilled, but their presence could not be excused. To them, a meal without the dead was an incomplete gathering, a betrayal of the family bond. It became customary, as the years wound on, for the living Whitlocks to speak to their dead during these suppers. A question about business might be directed to an uncle whose skin had long since pulled tight over his bones. A toast of wine might be raised toward a child whose glass remained untouched, dust gathering on the rim. There are accounts, gathered from servants and visitors who dared to speak, of whispered conversations, the living pausing, nodding, as if waiting for the silent dead to answer. To those outside the mansion, it was madness. To those inside, it was obligation. The dining hall itself began to change. The walls, once whitewashed and bright, grew heavy with the scent of herbs and oils meant to mask decay. Heavy drapes hung across the windows, keeping out sun and prying eyes alike. The grand table, crafted of oak and polished for wealthier days, was perpetually set for more guests than it held living. No place was ever cleared. Every plate, every goblet, every silver fork had its owner, whether they breathed or not. Dust clung to some, gleamed on others, but never were they removed. Servants were the ones who bore the brunt of the horror. They were tasked with cleaning, with dressing, with preserving what could no longer be preserved. More than one left Hollow Creek altogether, unwilling to carry food into that hall where lifeless eyes stared back at them. Yet some stayed, whether bound by loyalty, fear, or the promise of pay that doubled and tripled the longer they endured. They spoke in hushed voices of the meals, where silence hung heavier than air, broken only by the scrape of spoons and knives against plates, punctuated by the occasional murmur directed toward someone who had been dead for decades. By the late 1802nd, the practice was no longer questioned within the family. Children were raised to expect it, to understand that their grandparents, their aunts, their siblings would never leave them, not truly. The fear of loss, of absence, was smothered by this grotesque performance of togetherness. But the cost was steep. The Whitlocks became more reclusive than ever, unwilling to let outsiders witness the spectacle. The mansion, already shadowed and isolated, grew into a place of dread for the townsfolk, who swore they saw candles flicker in windows where no living person walked. And yet, to the Whitlocks, the dead were never gone. They were only silent. And so supper became a gathering of ghosts, a communion of flesh and memory, where no chair was ever empty, and no family member ever truly departed. The servants of Hollow Creek's great mansion carried burdens heavier than the trays of food they ferried through the Whitlock dining room. Their stories, whispered in kitchens and laundries long after the family's decline, survive in fragments, accounts of nights where silence pressed against the walls, broken only by the clinking of silverware and the faint, unnatural creak of a chair occupied by something that should not have been there. They told of duties no servant should have to endure, of tasks that blurred the boundary between the living and the dead. One maid, young and new to service, recounted her first evening in the house. She had been instructed to enter the dining room with a tureen of soup and set it at the head of the long mahogany table. When she stepped inside, her knees nearly gave way. The room was dim, lit by a sparse array of candles, but she saw the entire Whitlock family seated, some vibrant with breath, others shrouded in death's stillness. The matriarch, Mrs. Whitlock, sat propped at the table's end, her lips waxen and her eyes glazed over like dull marbles. Her husband spoke to her as if she were still alive, raising his glass in her direction and pausing expectantly, as though waiting for her reply. The maid's hands trembled, and a ladle clattered into the soup. She swore she felt those glassy eyes following her every step. That night she refused to sleep, convinced that the matriarch's corpse had risen from its chair and walked the halls. Another account came from a footman who stayed in service far longer than most. He claimed that by the late 1802nd, the Whitlocks had perfected their chilling ritual. Not only did they seat their dead at supper, but they dressed them for the occasion. The corpses wore the same fine silks and dark suits they had favored in life. Jewelry glimmered faintly at their wrists and throats. One uncle, who had been gone for a decade, still had a gold ring upon his brittle hand. The servants' duty was to maintain appearances. They powdered faces to mask discoloration, brushed wigs to hide thinning hair, and tied scarves at throats where stitches and seams betrayed the crude embalming beneath. The footman said the hardest part was clearing plates. Each corpse was served, as though refusing food would have been rude. He remembered carefully lifting a full plate of untouched roast from before the matriarch, terrified of brushing her stiff hands. Sometimes food would fall into their laps, staining the fabric, and it was the servants who had to clean it, lifting limp bodies just enough to change the soiled linens. He confessed that more than once he felt a faint resistance, as though the bodies did not wish to be moved. Whispers from the kitchen spoke of more sinister things. Some maids claimed to hear mutterings at the table, voices too low and layered to belong to the living. When they peered into the room, only the Whitlock patriarch's voice carried. Yet the air seemed crowded, as though others were speaking at once, their words threading through the silence like threads of smoke. One cook swore that when she passed through the dining hall late at night, the corpses leaned slightly differently than before, as if they had shifted seats after the meal ended. Of course, such stories were dismissed by outsiders as superstition or exaggeration. But the servants bore scars from their time in that household, some physical, some far worse. One young man, who lasted no more than 3 weeks, emerged with a streak of white through his hair. He claimed to have felt a hand cold, rigid, and skeletal rest on his shoulder while he poured wine at supper. When he turned, he found no one behind him. He left the mansion before dawn, refusing to return for his wages. Over the years, the Whitlocks' reputation darkened, and with it the testimonies grew. Servants no longer sought employment there willingly. They were coerced, or they came out of desperation. Each new arrival would be warned by those who remained. Never lock eyes with the dead, never linger in the dining room after the meal, and never, under any circumstances, stay in the house after midnight. Even so, some could not escape what they had seen. They carried the visions with them when they left Hollow Creek, unable to rid themselves of the sensation of glassy stares. One aging laundress, long retired, was said to keep a candle burning every night, claiming that if she let the flame go out, she would see them again, the Whitlocks, seated in their eternal supper, waiting for her to serve them once more. Those who ventured to Hollow Creek with an invitation to dine at the Whitlock estate often did so with equal parts curiosity and dread. The family was whispered about endlessly in neighboring towns, their wealth and influence granting them a kind of immunity from the gossip that would have ruined lesser names. Yet their eccentricities, and the palpable air of unease that clung to their home, were too powerful to ignore. Visitors who accepted the chance to step inside the infamous mansion rarely did so twice. The few who survived to tell their stories spoke of a nightmarish atmosphere cloaked in the guise of aristocratic hospitality. Others, those who vanished without a trace, became part of Hollow Creek's darker folklore, their absences feeding the growing unease that the Whitlocks were more than just reclusive oddities. Guests who crossed the iron gates of the estate were greeted by grandeur. The long carriage drive wound beneath ancient oaks, their gnarled branches leaning low as if conspiring to conceal the Whitlocks' secrets. The mansion itself, though elegant in its Gothic architecture, seemed to breathe gloom. The windows were tall and narrow, like watchful eyes. The stone walls loomed gray against the mist that perpetually rolled from the woods. To the untrained eye, it was a place of wealth and refinement, yet to those who lingered too long, it was unmistakably suffocating. The family greeted visitors with a veneer of warmth, men in fine suits, women draped in silks, their smiles as carefully painted as the portraits that lined the hall. The air smelled of beeswax polish, roses arranged in gilded vases, and roasted meats carried in from the kitchen. But beneath it all, faint and stubborn, was the scent of something less natural. A sour tang of decay, hidden beneath perfumes and spices yet never fully banished. It was at the dinner table where the true horror revealed itself. Guests would sit among Whitlock kin, each place setting gleaming with polished silver crystal glasses catching the candlelight. Yet there, seated in clothes decades out of fashion, were figures who did not belong. Pale and rigid, their skin waxy, their eyes glassy and vacant, they appeared at first to be grotesque dolls propped at the table. But the longer one stared, the clearer it became. These were not mannequins but preserved bodies of the departed. The Whitlocks treated them as though they were alive. A toast would be raised to Aunt Margaret, her lifeless hands folded neatly in her lap, while her descendants smiled fondly in her direction. A serving of pheasant would be placed before a grandfather whose lips, once sewn closed, now sagged slightly with age and rot. Children, wide-eyed and trembling, were shushed by their parents if they dared recoil at the sight. The family insisted upon the illusion those who had passed were merely quiet, but present all the same. For the guests, the polite charade was unbearable. Some claimed they excused themselves early, feigning illness, stumbling into the cool night air desperate for escape. Others told of nightmares that followed them home, dreams where dead faces leaned closer, mouths opening at last to whisper secrets in voices that smelled of dust and earth. A few returned to their towns pale and shaken, refusing to speak at all of what they had seen. And then there were those who did not return. Farmers' sons, merchants, even a wealthy banker from the city all vanished after accepting the Whitlocks' hospitality. The family denied knowledge of their whereabouts, suggesting accidents on the road, robberies by vagrants, or merely that their guests had changed their minds about visiting. But Hollow Creek whispered otherwise. It was said that sometimes, when new bodies appeared at the supper table, they were not Whitlocks at all. The stories grew darker as years passed. Travelers spoke of ghostly lights flickering in the woods around the estate, of screams carried faintly on the wind, of the iron gates creaking open at night when no carriage was near. Hollow Creek's children dared one another to approach the mansion, but none lingered long enough to glimpse more than its looming silhouette. The Whitlocks, it seemed, had surrounded themselves with silence save for the whispers of the dead and the lingering stench that no perfume could mask. By the end of the century, the number of those willing to accept a Whitlock invitation had dwindled to almost nothing. Those who remembered the vanished guests held their tongues, unwilling to cross a family so deeply entrenched in wealth and secrecy. But the rumors lived on, shaping the Whitlocks into legends as much as monsters. In Hollow Creek, it became an unspoken rule. If the Whitlocks invite you to dinner, you politely decline. By the turn of the century, Hollow Creek had grown into a quiet, almost forgotten township where gossip carried more weight than official records. Yet among the people who lived in its shadowed streets, nothing stirred conversation quite like the mansion at the edge of the woods. Its blackened spires pierced the sky like skeletal fingers, its windows reflecting only the dull gray of overcast days. The townsfolk spoke in hushed voices, never lingering long on the subject, as though words themselves might draw the house's attention. They called it cursed, a place that swallowed time and twisted those who crossed its threshold. Children, bold with the recklessness of youth, invented dares that tested courage against the mansion's brooding presence. They would sneak to its gates at dusk, racing one another to touch the iron bars before fleeing back to safety. Some swore they saw faces pressed against the upper windows, pale and motionless, watching. Others claimed to hear laughter carried on the wind, brittle and sharp, as though glass were breaking inside their ears. More than one child returned trembling, unable to explain why they suddenly felt a hand brush against theirs when no one stood beside them. Parents scolded, forbade, and prayed, but still the children returned, drawn by the thrill of fear that lingered like smoke over the estate. The adults, however, knew better than to dismiss the mansion's strangeness as mere games. Stories had reached Hollow Creek for decades, whispered accounts of dinners that lasted into dawn and music that played though no musicians were hired. The Whitlocks' name still surfaced in conversation, but never directly. Neighbors called them the ones on the hill, or those in the woods, refusing to speak of them plainly. In the general store, when a shipment of salt ran short, someone would inevitably mutter that the Whitlocks must have taken more again. When a stray dog went missing, eyes drifted toward the road leading to the estate. Nothing was ever proven. Yet suspicion had become as much a part of the community as the church bells or the mill. Those who lived nearest to the estate swore they could hear noises at night. Horses snorted and pawed at the ground when led past its gates. Farmers complained their cattle balked, refusing to graze on the fields that bordered the Whitlock property, as though sensing something unseen. A few older residents remembered a time when the Whitlocks still attended church, when the family was part of the town rather than apart from it. But after the matriarch's death, everything had changed. The family withdrew, shutters drawn tight, and the path to their door grew overgrown with weeds. Hollow Creek carried on, but always with one eye fixed toward the mansion, fearful that whatever lived within might someday spill out. The whisper of curses became a rhythm in the town's life. Newcomers were warned never to wander near the woods after sundown. Mothers pressed charms into their children's hands, beads or crosses meant to guard against unseen influences. On stormy nights when thunder rolled across the hills, the townsfolk would swear the lightning illuminated more figures in the Whitlocks' windows than the family still living could account for. It was said the dead sat there, row upon row, waiting to be acknowledged. Yet, despite the fear, there was fascination too. Rumors acted like gravity, pulling curious souls closer even as they pushed others away. Some spoke of treasures locked inside, rooms brimming with artifacts, or libraries that held secrets men weren't meant to know. Others warned that once the house knew your name, it never let go. Whispers drifted from hearth to hearth, across pews and porches, binding Hollow Creek to the mansion with invisible threads of dread. The Whitlocks might have tried to vanish into their rituals, but the town could never forget them. The house was alive in the collective mind, and in Hollow Creek, that was often more powerful than truth. The mansion stood unmoving, silent, yet always watching. Children dared, neighbors muttered, and Hollow Creek lived with the quiet certainty that something within those walls was waiting. And the longer the years passed, the more certain it seemed that the house itself was patient, biding its time, feeding on the fear of those who whispered its name only when the wind howled to cover their voices. In the brittle pages of the surviving Whitlock diaries, one finds not a straightforward record of daily life but a slow unraveling, a steady march toward madness woven into every entry. It begins subtly, with notations of sleepless nights, whispered concerns about shadows moving in the hall, and the uneasy sense that the departed members of the family were still present, not as memories but as tangible forces in the house. Early entries suggest attempts to rationalize these feelings, with explanations rooted in grief, stress, or the creaks and groans of the aging mansion. Yet as the years pass, the explanations fade, replaced by acceptance, then devotion to the notion that death did not remove the Whitlocks from their table. The Whitlock dining room had once been a place of chatter and warmth, but by the time the grim tradition had sunk its teeth into the family, all liveliness had drained from the table. What remained was ritual, ritual heavy with silence, ritual weighed down by the unspoken horror that accompanied every meal. Each supper became a theater of restraint, where the living forced themselves to eat as if nothing was wrong, while the dead presided in their stiff, unmoving seats. The food itself often went untouched for long stretches. Servants would carry in silver platters of roasted pheasant, venison, and steaming bowls of thick soups, the aromas filling the room with richness. Yet those smells clashed with something more sinister, the faint but inescapable undertone of age-old decay. Despite their efforts with herbs and perfumes, the corpses at the table carried a scent that lingered. It was not always strong, not always overpowering, but it was there, a whisper beneath the fragrance of thyme and lavender, a reminder that the diners were sharing their meal with what should have been beneath the earth. The Whitlocks, at least the ones still breathing, pretended not to notice. They sat stiffly, fork and knife in hand, taking measured bites as though they were being observed, and, in a way, they were. Their ancestors' empty eyes, clouded and glassy, stared across the table at them. Sometimes the servants swore those eyes shifted with the flickering candlelight, and sometimes a shadow fell just right to make it appear the dead were smiling. Meals passed in near silence. Gone were the conversations that once marked supper, the laughter, the gossip, the stories told over roasted meat and bread still warm from the oven. Now only the scraping of cutlery against porcelain filled the room, punctuated occasionally by the crack of something brittle. It might be the sound of a shifting jawbone, a stiffened neck giving way, or the brittle skin of an embalmed hand tearing slightly as gravity pulled against it. Whenever these noises broke the silence, the family members kept their eyes down, pretending to be engrossed in their meals. The servants, however, heard everything, and it was said some of them learned to count how many cracks would echo through the chamber in one supper, as though tallying omens. The food, no matter how well prepared, lost its warmth quickly. Perhaps it was because no one touched it with true appetite. The Whitlocks chewed slowly, swallowing as if each bite lodged in their throats. Perhaps, too, it was because the cold presence of their ancestors chilled the room, making every dish seem lukewarm. Some believed it was superstition. Others whispered it was the dead themselves who leached the heat from every platter, ensuring that nothing could stay warm in their company. Even the servants carried trays with reluctance. They would lower the platters to the table, eyes carefully averted, and retreat as quickly as dignity allowed. More than one footman confided later that they felt the air grow heavy when they crossed the threshold into the dining hall, as though invisible hands pressed against their chest. There were occasions when the corpses shifted in their seats. Whether it was the settling of brittle joints or the loosened ties of makeshift preservation, their movements rattled plates and rattled nerves. One servant reported that, during a dinner in late autumn, a preserved ant tilted sideways, her arm dragging against a wineglass until it toppled and shattered on the floor. Not a word was spoken. The family simply continued eating, as though nothing had happened, though the tremor in their hands betrayed the truth. To the outside world, the Whitlocks were eccentric aristocrats, but inside those walls, supper was a ritual of denial. The food was served hot, but it always went cold, untouched for too long. The silence grew heavier with each passing meal, broken only by the grotesque reminders that they dined with their ancestors, reminders that came in the crack of skin, the snap of bone, or the subtle shifting of the dead. As though they too longed for another taste of supper. It was not a meal, it was a performance, played out night after night, where the living acted as though nothing was wrong, and the dead, seated in their permanent places, completed the illusion. But the truth seeped through all the same, like the chill that clung to every dish, making sure that even when the food was brought to the table steaming, it never stayed warm for long. Paranoia becomes a constant undercurrent in their words. Some entries are filled with frantic scrawl, as if written in a fever, claiming that outsiders were plotting to steal the bodies, that neighbors wished to desecrate the family's sacred gathering. Locks were reinforced, windows sealed with iron bars, and threats were whispered against anyone who dared question their ways. The younger Whitlocks, raised in such an atmosphere, absorbed these fears as naturally as breathing. Their journals echo the voices of their elders, warnings of betrayal, mistrust of strangers, and the conviction that the world beyond Hollow Creek wished to destroy what the family held dear. There is, too, a pattern of obsessions, compulsions that repeat across generations. Lists of herbs, recipes for preservation mixtures, diagrams of seating arrangements at the table, all copied and recopied as if their very survival depended on the precision of the rituals. Margins are filled with calculations of time and temperature, with anxious notes about smells and discoloration, as though these details were more pressing than matters of business or livelihood. The diaries are less a chronicle of living than a manual for managing the dead, obsessively updated, as if refinement of the practice was the only goal worth pursuing. Some entries betray a crumbling grip on reality. Voices are described as if heard in the walls, or murmurs believed to come from the mouths of the long-preserved corpses themselves. Mother spoke tonight. One line reads, written in a shaky hand. She told me the roast was underdone. Another account speaks of a figure walking in the halls, indistinguishable in the gloom, though every living Whitlock was accounted for. These writings are not confined to one individual, but recur generation after generation, lending weight to the belief that madness was not an accident but an inheritance. Yet alongside these ravings, there is pride. Many entries speak of the family's endurance, their ability to keep loved ones with them when others could not. They considered themselves guardians of a truth unacknowledged by the outside world, a truth that life and death need not be separate realms. That conviction, repeated until it became doctrine, hardened into the bedrock of their decline. To abandon the practice would be to betray not only the dead, but the family identity itself. By the last of the diaries, the line between paranoia and devotion is gone. Every outsider is marked as a threat, every neighbor a spy, every creak in the mansion a voice of the departed. The writing is jagged, words collapsing into illegible scratches, as though the hand that held the pen could no longer keep pace with the racing mind. Madness had ceased to be an affliction, it was the family's legacy, passed down like the rituals themselves. The Whitlocks had not only lived with their dead, they had been consumed by them, body and soul, until Hollow Creek no longer spoke of the Whitlocks as people, but as whispers of something cursed, something forever entwined with death and decay. Starvation crept into the Whitlock estate like a patient thief, unnoticed at first, then undeniable. The great fields that once yielded corn, barley, and thick green vegetables lay fallow, the earth cracked and hungry for seed. Once, the family had employed dozens of laborers, ensuring a steady rotation of crops and livestock. But as the years wore on and their obsession with ritual deepened, fewer hands were set to plow, fewer seeds were sown, and fewer animals remained in their pens. The servants, already unnerved by the nightly presence of the preserved dead, left one by one, until the Whitlocks were left to their own devices, a clan cloistered within their manor, feeding more on delusions than on bread. It was said that the family table remained set as though for a feast, though what lay upon the platters grew more meager with every passing year. Where once roasted pheasant, pork, and spiced root vegetables had been laid in abundance, Now there were thin stews, stale bread, and at times nothing more than boiled weeds gathered from the edges of their property. Yet still the table remained crowded, every chair filled by living or embalmed Whitlock alike. The surviving members took their places beside blackened cadavers and glass-eyed patriarchs, acting as though the bounty of old days lingered before them. Their minds, frayed by ritual and madness, seemed unable to recognize their own hunger, or perhaps they found in starvation a kind of devotion, a sacrifice to the twisted legacy they sought to preserve. Visitors who peered through the windows in those years reported strange sights: a loaf of bread set untouched before a corpse whose cracked lips seemed to part in mockery of a smile, a child alive, but skeletal, gnawing on a crust, while his embalmed grandmother sat beside him, a plate of rotting fruit in front of her. The air inside was thick with the sour perfume of decay, layered over with clove and frankincense, as if scent itself could stand in for sustenance. The Whitlocks seemed to believe that to abandon the rituals, to neglect their dinners with the dead, would bring down curses upon them. And so they continued, even as ribs pressed against their pale skin, even as cheeks hollowed and eyes darkened from want. Diaries from this time reveal the paradox of their lives: endless words about honor, duty, and continuity, but scarce mention of hunger, of the gnawing pain that surely consumed them. The act of eating with the dead became more important than eating at all. Some claimed the Whitlocks began to starve deliberately, seeing in their wasting bodies a mirror of the corpses they adored. They grew skeletal, their faces taking on the same gaunt appearance as the embalmed, blurring the boundary between the living and the dead. To them, perhaps, starvation was a way of stepping closer to those they loved or feared enough to keep at the table for decades. By the end, the once prosperous family that had dominated Hollow Creek was a ruin. Their fields lay barren, their fortunes spent on herbs, salts, and oils to preserve the corpses rather than on seed or livestock. Their wealth, once flowing like wine, was dried to a trickle, invested in rituals that brought no nourishment. Yet even as the estate crumbled, the family clung to its obsession with devotion to the dead, starving themselves in pursuit of communion. What remained of them was not a dynasty, but a husk, a family consumed by its own traditions, left gaunt, fragile, and broken. The Whitlocks had not only neglected their fields and their fortune, they had neglected life itself. The storm that swept through Hollow Creek in the late 1802 was remembered as one of the most violent in living memory. The heavens opened with a rage that seemed biblical, torrents of rain washing over the land as if to cleanse it of something festering too long in silence. Lightning split the skies in great white veins, illuminating the hulking silhouette of the Whitford mansion on its hill, each flash making it appear less like a home and more like a ruinous fortress guarding unspeakable secrets. For decades, the townsfolk had whispered of the strange practices within its walls, of the meals held in the presence of the dead, but never had they dared venture too close. That night, however, the storm would force open the doors to horrors no one had wanted confirmed. The mansion stood in the storm's path like a stubborn relic. Shutters tore free, crashing against stone walls with deafening force. Glass shattered from its windows, scattering across the grounds in gleaming fragments that caught the lightning. The wind howled through the trees surrounding the estate, bending even the strongest oaks as if they were twigs. The creek that gave the town its name swelled and broke its banks, roaring toward the village below. And so it was that a group of men, farmers, a blacksmith, and a preacher set out with lanterns to reach the hill, hoping to secure the mansion's occupants. They believed, or perhaps hoped, that someone still living resided within, and that duty compelled them to offer rescue. When they reached the great iron gates, they found them already swung wide. Chains snapped as though pried apart by unseen hands. One man swore that he had heard laughter carried on the wind, though the others dismissed it as thunder. The front doors loomed tall and imposing, but the storm had weakened their hinges. With a crash like a cannon, one was torn free and slammed against the inner wall, revealing the dark cavern of the grand foyer. The rescuers hesitated, their lanterns flickering in the rushing gusts, before stepping inside. The air was stagnant, thick with the odor of mildew and something else, something acrid, spoiled, and heavy with decay. The storm illuminated the interior in brief flashes, each one showing more of the grotesque reality long hidden. Portraits hung crooked on the walls, their painted eyes seeming to watch the intruders as they passed. Rugs were moth-eaten, walls water-stained, and cobwebs hung in sheets from the high ceilings. But it was not the ruin that drew their breath short. It was the figures at the dining table, illuminated by a strike of lightning so sudden and violent it seemed divine. There, seated in ornate high-backed chairs, was the Whitford family, or what remained of them. Their skin clung to bone in papery layers, clothing long faded and eaten by time. The patriarch sat at the head, one skeletal hand resting on the armrest, his empty sockets turned toward the intruders, as though still presiding over supper. Around him, wife, sons, and daughters, slumped in their places, stiffened into grotesque statues by years of death. Before them, the table was set as though the meal had only just been interrupted. Plates of blackened food, shriveled fruits, and clouded goblets still filled the long table, the air heavy with the stench of long decayed feasts. One of the men screamed, dropping his lantern to the floor. The others crossed themselves, the preacher mumbling prayers under his breath as though words alone could drive back the evil surrounding them. Yet none could look away. Lightning again illuminated the corpses, and in that flicker of light, one swore he saw the matriarch's head tilt ever so slightly, as though disturbed by the sudden company. Another swore the sound of brittle skin cracking filled the silence, though whether it was the storm tearing at the rafters or the shifting of the long dead, none could say with certainty. The rescuers did not linger. With trembling hands and pale faces they backed away, leaving the storm to howl through the open mansion. Word spread quickly through Hollow Creek that the Whitfords were no longer a matter of rumor but a blasphemous truth, preserved in their grotesque rituals until nature itself tore their secret wide open. No one returned to the mansion that night, nor the next, and when at last the storm cleared, the house remained an open wound on the hill, daring any who might approach to step inside and face the horrors left at that table. From that night onward, Hollow Creek was never the same. The storm had stripped away not only roofs and trees but the fragile barrier of disbelief. The Whitfords had been exposed, their grotesque rituals laid bare, and though the mansion still stood, no villager could look upon it without hearing the echoes of thunder, smelling the rot beneath the perfumes, or recalling the hollow, eternal supper that lightning had revealed. When the storm had passed and the rescuers returned with proper authorities, a decision was made to enter the mansion once more. This time not for rescue but to discover what had been left inside. The house stood wounded, its walls bowed and splintered from the force of the tempest, windows shattered, and roof beams sagging with rainwater. The great front doors, once grand in their heavy oak and iron fixtures, gave way with little effort, their hinges warped from decades of neglect and the night's violence. Inside, the air was thick, heavy with the sweet sick scent of rot that had settled deep into the wooden bones of the structure. Dust rose from the disturbance, mingling with the dampness of storm-soaked fabric and paper, a choking veil that made even the strongest men pause. The rescuers had entered with lanterns, their light casting trembling shadows on the peeling wallpaper. Some prayed under their breath, others crossed themselves instinctively, though none said it aloud. They feared what they would find. The first rooms they entered parlors, sitting areas. Studies were neglected but not unusual. Faded curtains drooped over shattered glass, shelves had collapsed beneath the weight of forgotten books, and portraits of stern ancestors glared from the walls, with eyes that seemed too alive in the flickering light. But it was not until they entered the grand dining hall that the true horror of the Whitlocks revealed itself. There, beneath the still-hanging chandelier whose crystal pendants had darkened with dust and cobwebs, sat a long dining table of dark mahogany. Time had cracked its surface, yet its structure remained solid, as though even decay itself respected its purpose. Around it were arranged the Whitlocks, though they were no longer living. The rescuers froze, their lantern light steadying to reveal the grotesque tableau. The family sat in their chairs as though awaiting a meal that would never arrive. The skin of their faces had hardened into parchment, stretched thin over bone, mouths slack, sockets hollow where eyes once had been. Their clothing, though frayed, still bore traces of finery velvet gowns, lace collars, embroidered waistcoats all dulled by dust but unmistakably rich. The matriarch, her desiccated hand resting on the table's surface, seemed to preside still, her head tilted toward the empty chair at the far end. That chair, unlike the others, bore no occupant but was laid with plate, goblet, and silver cutlery polished to a strange gleam, as though it had been maintained long after everything else was abandoned. What chilled the investigators most was not the state of the dead, but the orderliness of their arrangement. None had collapsed or slumped as one might expect of bodies left to time. They had been placed carefully, deliberately, seated upright, hands folded, backs straight. The children were positioned beside their parents, the eldest son, with a stiffened arm draped around his mother's chair. It was as if the family had been frozen in the very act of dining, mummified by choice rather than chance. On the plates before them lay remnants of meals. But these were no ordinary remnants. Blackened lumps of what might once have been bread crumbled to dust when touched. Shriveled husks of meat clung to bone fragments, their identity unrecognizable. Cups still held the thick residue of liquid long evaporated, leaving behind a crust of reddish-brown that some thought to be wine, though others whispered uneasily that it looked too dark. One man retched into a corner, while another muttered that they should leave the house untouched, for surely it was cursed. Yet curiosity drove them further in, their lanterns catching on details that only deepened their dread. Beneath the table, bones lay scattered small, brittle bones that did not match the arrangement above. They appeared gnawed, cracked in ways that spoke not of animals but of desperate human teeth. A silence settled heavy on the rescuers as the realization passed between them without words. The Whitlocks had feasted in ways that no human should. And yet, the question remained, who had seated them like this? Had the family themselves arranged their own final supper, clinging to ritual until death claimed them all? Or had some surviving member, slipping into madness, placed them there as grotesque guardians of tradition before succumbing to starvation or something far worse? No journal, no voice remained to explain, only this horrific still life preserved in dust and ruin. The men backed away at last, some crossing themselves again, others unable to take their eyes from the empty chair at the head of the table. It remained an open wound in the scene, a place waiting, expectant, as though for a guest still to come. And in the echoing hush of the abandoned hall, one could almost believe the Whitlocks were still waiting, their silence not empty but full of intent. The storm had passed, leaving the town of Hollow Creek battered, but it was the discovery within the mansion that clung to the townsfolk's minds like a lingering fog. The Whitlocks, what remained of them, sat stiffly in their grotesque eternal banquet. The rescuers who had stumbled upon the scene stumbled back into the streets, their faces pale as ash, carrying word of the horror that lay inside. Soon the entire town knew, and the question that rose among them was simple yet terrifying. What was to be done with the bodies? The town elders convened, gathering in the church beneath the worn wooden beams that seemed suddenly inadequate against such a blasphemous burden. Their hushed voices carried unease as the decision hung between tradition and fear. The dead, by right, should have been buried in consecrated ground, laid to rest beside generations of Hollow Creek citizens. But the Whitlocks were different. Whispers spoke of their madness, their occult practices, the unnatural stillness of their corpses, as if they had not merely died, but chosen some vile imitation of eternity. One elder, his hands trembling as he gripped the pew, said what others dared not. "If we bury them in holy ground, their spirits will not rest, they will follow us." His words settled over the room like a dark verdict. Others nodded, muttering prayers under their breath, crossing themselves as though the Whitlocks could hear. It was decided then, quietly, reluctantly, that the family would not be given the rites of the church. The bodies were left where they were for days, the stench of old decay seeping through the cracked windows of the mansion. Children dared one another to creep close and swear they saw movement within, though none could confirm if it was imagination or truth. Men hired to cart the bodies away refused, claiming their horses balked violently whenever they neared the mansion gates. Even animals, it seemed, would not tolerate the dead Whitlocks. At last, a group of men from outside the town was summoned, laborers with no connection to Hollow Creek. They were promised coin and warned of the grotesque task. With thick cloths tied around their faces, they entered the mansion, pried the stiff figures from their chairs, and carried them into waiting carts. The corpses were disturbingly light, as though hollowed from within, their skin brittle enough to flake beneath rough handling. Some whispered that the eyes of the patriarch still seemed to glimmer faintly, though no torchlight touched them. But even in transport, the unease grew. Horses shied, wheels cracked, and the men swore they heard faint creaks from the shrouded bundles. One fled mid-journey, tossing his coin purse to the ground and swearing never to return. The carts were eventually abandoned on the outskirts of Hollow Creek, left in the shadow of the trees where the road dissolved into wilderness. None dared bury them. None dared burn them. To destroy the remains felt like provoking something far older and darker than themselves. So the Whitlocks were left to the elements, their corpses laid in shallow pits, hastily covered with stone and brush, far from consecrated earth. The ground never settled there. Each storm washed soil away, exposing fragments of bone and brittle fabric, as if the land itself rejected them. Locals avoided the area, warning children never to wander near. They claimed the air was always colder there, the trees strangely warped, their branches curling downward as if bowing to something unseen beneath the earth. Stories grew quickly. Travelers told of hearing faint whispers near the burial site, of seeing pale figures in the distance that vanished when approached. Hollow Creek's people began to speak of the Whitlocks not as gone, but as waiting unfinished, unburied in the truest sense. The family's mansion loomed behind them, its windows like watchful eyes, and the unholy ground before them became a scar the town could never heal. The Whitlocks had been denied the peace of the grave, and in that denial, the fear of Hollow Creek only deepened. Their spirits, it was said, roamed restlessly, seeking the home they were exiled from, whispering in the night to those who dared listen. For though their bodies had been cast out, the legacy of their presence remained like a shadow stitched into the very soil. The Whitlock estate, emptied of its occupants yet heavy with their lingering presence, did not remain sealed for long. After years of legal disputes and whispered arguments among distant relations, the mansion's possessions were finally ordered to be sold off. Notices were posted in town and across neighboring counties, drawing in collectors, opportunists, and those who came more for curiosity than acquisition. The auction was to be held on the mansion grounds itself, though the rooms where the Whitlocks had been discovered were carefully closed off, as if shielding the living from their grotesque final tableau. On the morning of the sale, the air felt charged, as though the storm that had once cracked the mansion open had never entirely left. Dark clouds loomed low over the estate, and the trees bent in an unnatural hush, as if listening. The locals who gathered stood with arms crossed, their faces pale. Most would not step across the threshold, preferring to keep a wary distance. Only outsiders, dealers, antique hunters, men with fat purses, and little imagination seemed eager to wander the halls and place their bids. The auctioneer's voice rang through the grand parlor, hollow and echoing. The first items were portraits, oils of severe men and women with sunken eyes and stiff posture. Each painting, though finely done, carried with it a sense of scrutiny, as though the eyes within the gilded frames refused to rest. One bidder, a gentleman from Boston, won a set of 3 Whitlock portraits for a modest sum. When he carried them away, the townsfolk muttered warnings under their breath. Weeks later, rumors drifted back that the man's household had been plagued by unrelenting insomnia, his wife insisting she heard whispers behind the canvas, while servants swore the painted eyes followed them from one room to another. Next came the furniture, high-backed chairs carved from oak, their arms worn smooth by generations of anxious grips, wardrobes that creaked and groaned when opened, even when freshly polished. A massive dining table scarred by years of meals both ordinary and ritual. A wealthy family from New Haven purchased the dining table, charmed by its craftsmanship. Within months, Tragedy struck them, strange sickness took hold of their children, and every meal was accompanied by an eerie silence that unsettled their guests. It was said that the family eventually locked the dining room and refused to enter it again. The journals came last, leather-bound, brittle with age, and filled with cramped handwriting. They were auctioned off in stacks, often without explanation of their contents. Some buyers believed them to be of historical interest, while others thought they might contain hidden recipes or genealogies. Yet those who dared to read found themselves ensnared by the same obsessions that had haunted the Whitlocks. A scholar in Providence who purchased several volumes wrote feverishly about voices between the lines before vanishing from his home one night, his notes left unfinished on his desk. Another buyer claimed he heard scratching at his windows whenever he opened the books, as if the words themselves summoned something waiting just beyond sight. Despite these whispered tales, the auction continued, item after item, until the house was nearly bare. Rugs, candlesticks, silverware, each carried away, each soon to be linked with stories of misfortune. Townsfolk watched silently as the pieces of the Whitlock curse dispersed into the world like ashes carried by the wind. They knew, with the unshakable certainty of those who lived nearest to darkness, that such things did not simply lose their weight when sold. When the last of the items had been carted off, the mansion stood emptier than ever before, its once grand rooms stripped of the objects that gave it shape. Yet the air inside remained suffocating, the shadows just as thick. It was as if the essence of the Whitlocks, the madness that had consumed them, lingered not only in the house but also in every possession that had left its walls. The auction was remembered not as a dispersal of wealth but as the scattering of a curse, one that would find root wherever the Whitlocks' belongings came to rest. For years afterward, stories would resurface of inexplicable illnesses, sudden deaths, and uncanny disturbances, all tracing back to those who had walked away from the Whitlock auction with their prize. Some sold the objects again, hoping to free themselves, only to spread the misfortune further. Others burned or buried them, but even then, peace was not always restored. The Whitlocks, it seemed, had found a way to endure not through their flesh, but through the very items that had surrounded them in life and in death. The locals, who had wisely refused to bid on a single thing, only shook their heads whenever news arrived of another misfortune. They had known better than to touch the Whitlock legacy. But the outsiders had not listened, and so the curse of the Whitlocks was no longer contained within the mansion's walls. It traveled now, silent and unseen, resting in parlors, studies, and dining rooms across New England, where unsuspecting families lived under the gaze of portraits, dined at haunted tables, or opened journals that whispered secrets meant never to be known. They thought the Whitlock mansion would grow quiet once its doors had been forced open, its dead paraded before horrified eyes, and its possessions scattered to greedy buyers. Yet silence never took hold within those walls. For years after the grisly discovery, the mansion seemed to breathe on its own, clinging to the voices, the gestures, the rituals that had devoured the Whitlock family. Those brave or foolish enough to cross its threshold spoke of experiences so eerily consistent that whispers of a curse became impossible to ignore. The accounts always began innocuously, with visitors feeling a sudden drop in temperature, as though the air within the dining room had been chilled by unseen hands. Dust hung heavy in the air, cobwebs clung to the high beams, and yet, beneath the ruin, guests swore they heard a faint clatter, like silver cutlery against porcelain plates. At first, many laughed it off, thinking their imaginations had been poisoned by local tales. But the sound would persist, following them from the dining hall into the parlor, echoing softly down the corridors, impossible to place yet impossible to ignore. Soon came the laughter. It was never joyous, never hearty. It was thin, restrained, and unsettlingly polite, as if it belonged to a family still bound by manners even in death. More than one intruder recalled standing frozen in the foyer as a faint chorus of mirth trickled down the staircase, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of chairs scraping against the dining table. When they summoned their courage and approached, the long table remained empty, yet the impressions of bodies seemed pressed into the faded velvet of the chairs. Others spoke of voices, murmurs that carried no distinct words, but always had the cadence of grace before a meal. or the rhythm of whispered toasts. A young man who dared to sleep one night inside the drawing room claimed he woke to find every chair in the dining hall had been drawn out, as though for a grand feast. He had not touched a single one before bedding down. Terrified, he fled before dawn, leaving behind his lantern and pack. Both were found days later by townsfolk who refused to set foot inside. But perhaps the most disturbing tales came from those who lingered too long. A few visitors claimed that after several hours within, they felt compelled to sit at the table. One woman, an amateur historian, recounted how she had wandered into the dining hall and, without realizing why, took a seat at the head of the table. She folded her hands, her posture stiff and formal, and for several long minutes she could not will her body to move. She described the sensation as if unseen hands were guiding her, pressing her spine upright, holding her lips closed in reverent silence. When she finally broke free, she ran from the mansion in hysterics, vowing never to return. Stories like these spread quickly through nearby towns, and the mansion earned its reputation as cursed. Clergymen warned their congregations not to trespass, saying the Whitlocks had bound themselves through their rituals, their obsession refusing them rest. Superstitious farmers refused to walk the road that passed near the estate after dusk, muttering that the Whitlocks were still hungry, still waiting for guests to join them. Even skeptics, those who mocked the tales and dismissed them as country gossip, found themselves rattled. One land agent who had considered buying the property went inside to examine it during the day. By the time he returned to town, his hair had turned noticeably gray. He refused to say what he had seen, only muttering that the mansion did not want to be sold. Over time, the Whitlock estate became a place of challenge for the daring. Young men tried to prove their courage by sneaking inside at night, some staying long enough to hear the faint tinkle of glasses raised in silent toasts. Few lasted more than an hour before bolting into the woods. Those who claimed to last longer often returned, changed, quieter, thinner, as though some weight had settled onto their souls. And always, at the center of every story, was the same refrain. The clink of cutlery at an empty table. The polite laughter of voices long dead, and the sensation that the Whitlocks were still hosting their final supper, eternally waiting for the living to take their places. The curse of the mansion was not flames or collapse, nor any violent display of power. It was subtler, more insidious. The persistence of ritual beyond the grave. A family's obsession echoing through time, inviting all who dared enter to become a guest at a feast that never ended. Hollow Creek was a quiet town, the kind where generations settled and little changed with the years. Yet, at its heart stood the Whitlock mansion, a hollow reminder of the family, whose name still carried a whisper of unease. Long after the Whitlocks had perished and their bodies were left to the uncertain care of history, their legend lived on not because the people of Hollow Creek celebrated them, but because they feared them. The house itself became the centerpiece of stories told in hushed tones at taverns, around campfires, and in the dim lamplight of children's bedrooms. No family ever managed to stay within its walls for long. Some left within weeks, others in months, but all claimed the mansion was impossible to live in. The walls carried with them more than decay. They seemed to pulse with memory. Each visitor felt as if the Whitlocks had never truly left. One of the earliest attempts at occupation came from the Wilkerson family, drawn to the mansion's grandeur at a time when its market value had plummeted. They dreamed of restoring it to its former glory, hoping to turn the estate into a bed and breakfast for travelers. At first, they chalked up the creaks in the floorboards and the groan of the wind through cracked windows to the age of the structure. But when their eldest son refused to sleep in his room, claiming that people were sitting at the table in the dining hall long after everyone had gone to bed, they grew uneasy. Their stay lasted only 3 months. They departed without notice, leaving half their belongings behind. Then came the Granger brothers, ambitious men from the city, who sought to strip the mansion for its antiques and resell them. They scoffed at the townsfolk's warnings, certain that the stories were nothing more than provincial superstition. But the longer they stayed, the thinner and paler they became. One brother claimed to hear cutlery scraping on plates during the night, though the dining table sat bare. The other spoke of muffled laughter that echoed through the halls, faint and cold, as if the sound came from beneath the floor. By the time they abandoned the project, both were gaunt, shadows of themselves. Rumor said that one of them never fully recovered. So it went for years, each new family or ambitious entrepreneur, drawn by the mansion's promise of wealth and beauty, only to be driven away by something less tangible, something that lingered in the air like rot beneath roses. Some reported shadows moving where no light could cast them. Others spoke of mirrors that seemed to reflect strangers rather than their own faces. Children cried through the night, clutching at their ears, insisting they heard voices calling them by name. In Hollow Creek, the pattern grew too obvious to ignore. Locals stopped seeing the mansion as a house at all and began to think of it as a vessel for the Whitlocks' restless echoes. Generations came and went, but no family stayed long enough to weave themselves into the house's story. It belonged to the Whitlocks still, and it seemed they would not release their claim. By the turn of the new century, the mansion was no longer sought after for restoration or habitation. Instead, it became a curiosity, a place to dare the brave or the foolish to enter. Teenagers crept through the gates on stormy nights, hoping to glimpse the flicker of candlelight in empty rooms. Travelers passing through sometimes stopped to marvel at its decayed beauty, snapping photographs to take home as proof of the infamous Hollow Creek curse. Yet beneath the thrill-seekers' laughter, the townsfolk kept their distance. They knew the stories too well. They knew that the Whitlocks' ruin had not ended with their deaths, but continued to seep into the world of the living, and as long as the mansion stood, Hollow Creek would never be free of its echoes. The legend persisted, not because it was retold, but because it was lived. Those who entered the mansion did not leave unchanged. The Whitlocks, though long gone, remained. The invitation was never spoken, never written, and yet it lingered in the air of Hollow Creek like a perfume that would not fade. For years after the mansion's terrible revelations, people whispered that the Whitlocks were still waiting, still hungry, still seated at that grotesque table where death had not been enough to separate them. Some said that the clink of cutlery in the empty dining hall was not only an echo, but a summons. The legend grew with each retelling, embroidered by the tongues of those who lived in the shadow of the mansion. It was said that travelers passing along the creek at twilight could glimpse candlelight through the tall, grimy windows, flickering flames that should not have existed in a house long abandoned. More than one fisherman swore he had seen a shadow rise behind the curtains, tall and thin, moving as though setting a table, arranging forks and knives, preparing for company. The Whitlock story ends where it began, around a table set for supper. No matter how many years pass, locals swear that the mansion never rests. Travelers see its windows glowing faintly, though the house is abandoned. Hunters claim they've heard the rattle of cutlery drifting from within. And sometimes, those who dare to peek through cracked shutters say they've seen it a long dining table, gleaming with crystal, silverware, and untouched meals that never rot. At its head, blurred in shadow, sit figures too stiff to be alive yet too present to be gone. Their faces can never be clearly seen, as if the house itself denies you a glimpse. But one thing always stands out: the empty chair, pulled slightly back, waiting. It said the Whitlocks are still dining, still locked in that eternal meal, unwilling to let go of the world they once ruled. They wait for a guest, anyone reckless enough to take that seat. For those who enter the mansion, the danger is not the creaking stairs, nor the shattered glass, nor even the whispered laughter in the halls. The danger lies in the invitation, because once you sit at that table, once you raise the silver fork and take a bite of that eternal feast, you may never leave again. And so, the locals warn: if you are ever invited to supper in Hollow Creek, decline. The Whitlocks have been waiting too long, and they do not take kindly to refusal.